Today I'm excited to tell you about early results from a systematic review examining the role of mate competition in speciation and divergence. A major focus in evolutionary biology is to understand what generates and maintains diversity. And to do that, we need to understand a variety of potential mechanisms and their interactions. Early reviews of the selective forces driving speciation often focused on whether natural selection or sexual selection alone could generate new species. But more recent work provides really convincing evidence that these forces rarely act alone. So our current focus is determining the conditions under which natural versus sexual selection are more or less likely to play an important role in population divergence and speciation, as well as understand their interactions. Yet, most of the role of sexual selection in driving speciation has focused disproportionately on mate choice, most often in females, and neglected the role of mate competition, most often in males. In sexual selection, competition for mates favors the evolution of mating traits that increase mating opportunities and reproductive success, like traits that are used for fighting or signaling competitive ability. The strength of sexual selection via mate competition is on par with that of mate choice and natural selection within populations. And between populations, traits can diverge arbitrarily or due to competition for resources via mate competition, and such trait divergence through mate competition can limit gene flow between populations. Here, we systematically review the literature to determine how mate competition contributes to divergence. When does it increase, maintain, or decrease divergence, and when does it have little effect? When is mate competition a driver of divergence, and when is it a contributor? What we do here is synthesize data across a suite of factors that likely influence the role of mate competition in divergence. And by doing that, we broadly evaluated current evidence for the role of mate competition in speciation, identified gaps in available evidence, articulated new hypotheses, and outlined promising directions for future work. We tested predictions for the role of mate competition in divergence across stages of divergence, geographic contexts, and mating systems. And we also evaluated how the role of mate competition in divergence is affected by interactions with mate choice and ecology. We collected papers for our review by searching on Web of Science for these keyword strings, and each of those terms with divergence, and then each of those terms with speciation. And that returned 377 papers. We included papers that were the source of empirical data rather than reviews or book chapters. We included papers that looked at competition for mates in the context of differentiation at any stage, from within population to between species. We excluded papers that only looked at competition within populations without looking at alternative reproductive strategies or competitive morphs. And we excluded papers that only looked at morphological or genetic differences between groups without looking at the consequences, so without looking at aggressive behavior or competitive outcomes. And that returned 107 papers. In today's talk, I'll tell you about a subset of variables that we measured. Well, I'll tell you about contributions to divergence overall, by stage of divergence, and by geographic context. And then I'll also tell you about interactions with mate choice and ecology. So first, here are the contributions of mate competition to divergence, with increase, maintain, little effect, decrease, unclear, and other on the x-axis, and number of studies on the y-axis. And above each bar, I have the number of studies, but I'm going to interpret the patterns as percentages. So the majority of studies, 64%, report that mate competition increases or maintains divergence. Just over 20% of studies reported unclear findings, so they couldn't link their results to the potential for divergence. And lastly, we found few cases where competition was found to decrease the likelihood of divergence. So overall, we found substantial support from the literature that mate competition facilitates divergence. When we break down these patterns by stage of divergence, within population, and between species, we found that the frequency of cases where mate competition increases divergence were more common between more diverged groups, so between populations and between species. In contrast, within populations, It was most common that mate competition would maintain existing differences, or it was unclear what effect mate competition had. So these findings suggest that mate competition might be a more important force once some divergence has occurred and other barriers to gene flow have evolved. By comparing across geographic contexts, we saw patterns from sympatry to secondary contact to allopatry. Moving from sympatry to allopatry, cases where mate competition increased divergence became more frequent, while maintains divergence and unclear effects decreased from sympatry to allopatry. And this suggests that, as expected, stronger limits on gene flow increase the likelihood of divergence via mate competition. For interactions with mate choice and mate competition, we found that nearly half of papers did not test or report previous findings about interactions with mate choice. But of the papers that reported interactions, 37% of them found that selection from competition and choice act in concert, so they act similarly on the same trait. 14% found that competition and choice act in opposing directions on the same trait, and 8% found that competition and choice act independently or select on different traits. This higher percentage of cases where mate competition and choice act in concert could facilitate the strength and speed of selection and the potential for divergence. For interactions with ecology, we also found that often these interactions are not reported, so 43% of studies don't measure ecology or report previous findings. When interactions with ecology were measured, 18% found that ecology is a driver, so environmental differences drive divergent evolution of the competitive trait. 20% found that ecology is a contributor. Environment influences the success of the competitive trait. And 36% found that resource distribution through patchy environments increased the likelihood of competition. These findings highlight that ecology commonly shapes the evolution and divergence of competitive traits, yet many studies do not report these interactions. So future work should evaluate the role of ecology and its potential interactions with mate competition more consistently. Our analysis is still in progress, but these early results are providing a clearer picture of the conditions under which mate competition contributes to divergence. And this review will help redefine our understanding of speciation by sexual selection by incorporating contributions of mate competition. Thanks so much for listening.